This video is about creating a wand for a costume. I was cosplaying a Death Eater from Harry Potter and wanted to create a special wand for this costume. It's a combination of wood turning and 3D printing. So we'll start with the 3D printing side. I'm not going to go into the details of how this model was created. It took me many hours, and honestly, I'm still new to this type of modeling. This is in SketchUp, but it's using a few tools that are different from the typical SketchUp workflow. This is a workflow that deals with what's called quad modeling, and that deals a lot with moving and manipulating individual surfaces and endpoints in a way kind of different from the typical SketchUp workflow. But you create a rough mesh, and then you're able to smooth it into a very nice smooth mesh. It subdivides the rough mesh, and it's great for organic modeling, this type of thing. But again, I'm fairly new to this. I made a lot of mistakes, and I'm still learning how best to work with this. But for this type of project, I was creating this raven's skull, thinking that my character may be, from Ravenclaw. So with the mesh ready, it was off to be 3D printed. And watching a 3D printer work, especially in a time lapse like this, it's sort of magical. So the 3D print was complete. And now it was time to go to the rest of the wand, the wood portion, and turn that up. I started with a simple blank, and I was trying out a piece of walnut. I was also doing multi-axis turning. Snap. Obviously, I was a little too aggressive for my cut, so I snapped that piece of walnut. And let's try again. This time I tried with a piece of hickory. And the multi-axis turning, if you're not familiar with it, it's a pretty simple idea in that you're just taking the tailstock really and moving it a little bit off axis. And for this purpose, I'm moving it just by a few millimeters, just barely, just to get some sort of interesting shapes in the main body of the wand. Here I was taking really light passes. After I snapped the last example, I was taking it really light. So this is sped up, but it was going nice and easy. I'm also sanding as I go because I don't want to have to go back and try and recapture that multi-axis turning. So here you get an idea of sort of how light cuts I was taking. I'm slowing back down to real speed, and I'm just barely going in, especially when roughing out on the multi-axis. And then once I get it a little taken down, I can go in a little faster, but now speeding up again. I just did a few little segments of multi-axis and then turned the rest. It's just simple spindle turning, nothing too elaborate, but it was a lot of fun. It's the first time I tried it, and definitely gonna try again. So the main body of the wand is mostly finished, a little rough still, and I want to turn down the tenon that's going to fit into the 3D printed skull. I printed the skull with a mortise, if you will, so that I could combine these together, and then I'm just using calipers to make sure that I get the sizing right. With the wand turned, I'm adding a few details. This is a simple trick that a lot of people know, using a wire and holding it onto the spindle, the friction heats up and burns the wood itself. So I've turned a fair number of wands just for my own kids and my nieces and nephews, and this is a fun embellishment if you get into doing some wand turning. But then I hid it by putting on a dark finish, so it didn't really show up anyway. Oh well. I like to put a finish on, not on all of the wands I create, but if I put a dark finish on, I usually will come back with some steel wool and try and buff out a lot of the finish so that it gives it a really worn and weathered look. You get a lot of variation in the color. It's a nice finish. I like it anyway. Another embellishment that I've done on some is you take a Dremel and simply just with a rounded bit, you go in and start creating just a few little holes, and it heats up the bit enough that it actually burns. So I'm probably ruining this bit a little bit, but it works well for this purpose, so I guess I'm willing to sacrifice that bit. And this is a concave shape. It works certainly well on convex or more bulbous. It's a nice little decoration, little detail that's fairly easy to add. So that was it. I just put on a final coat of some paste wax and ready to take it off. Cut the ends off and just treat the edge a little bit. I have this little sanding mop that's pretty much at the end of its life. I throw in my drill press, but it works well for taking the little bit of a burr off of these spindle turnings. So here you can see the wand as it's going to get put together. Fits well and ready to be glued. Using just a simple cyanacrylate glue and an accelerator so I can put these on and glue it pretty much instantly. Now the idea in my mind was that the transition between the wood and the what's supposed to be a sort of silver handle, that transition is sort of this sort of welded, not well defined transition. So I started taking the glue and just putting it on and spraying it so that it built up a bit of a finish around it so that there wasn't any defined edges there. And then I would come back and finish that and paint it in a way that would sort of complement that transition. But it worked well enough that I actually came back later and put little bits of glue over much of the handle, and that gave a lot of texture. And then instead of silver, I found that painting it dark and then coming back and rubbing it with silver acrylic gave it a really nice finish and brought out that texture. So that's how it was ultimately finished, as I just rubbed it. Needed to get into some of the crevices, but basically just put on some simple silver acrylic paint and then buff it in, and that was about it. I was really happy with the results. It was a great compliment to a really fun costume. I wore this at the Denver Comic-Con this year. And I was also inspired by Bill Doran of Punished Props, who went to Emerald City Comic-Con and gave away a number of his own props. It was a really cool gesture, so I created a couple wands, extra wands, and gave them out at the Denver Comic-Con to some Harry Potter cosplayers that I came across.